Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So, you might remember in my last episode, I talked about the weirdness of religion, how it seems so irrational from a secular or, if you like, post-Enlightenment standpoint, or how strange it might seem to, maybe somebody visiting from another planet or something like that. Today, I'd like to talk about the various attempts that have been made to explain religion by people in the secular West, and why I think one explanation in particular works best. I also wanted to share some recent neurological discoveries and some recent speculation by some scientists about unitive, or if you like, mystical states that you might find surprising and interesting. So, why has humankind, the rational animal, practiced this thing called religion? It's a question that's really sort of confounded us in the post Enlightenment world. We have lots of attempts to explain it, but I don't think really a lot of consensus. I think probably the most common secular take on religion today is that it has served humanity as a kind of proto-science, an attempt to explain nature before there was science, to explain how and why things in nature work the way they do. I'm thinking about myths, especially, these origin myths that explain how such and such a thing came to be. And then related to this, it's seen as a sort of proto-technology. If I do this, sacrifice to the gods, for example, then this can be expected to happen. And with these things comes a reassuring sense that there's an explanation for things, and also that things are, to some extent, under our control. And of course, the modern critique of this is that it has given humanity a sort of false hope about these things. Another explanation, and this has also served as fuel for attacks on religion since the Enlightenment, is that it's been a means for the powerful classes to control the rest of the population. Thomas Paine, for example, the American thinker he was involved actually in both the American and French revolutions, wrote, "My own mind is my own church. All national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, appear to me no other than human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit." And actually, this isn't really a new idea, I don't think. I mean, Aristotle, for example, talks about religion being manipulated for political ends. And then, of course, there's this theory of Marx that religion is the opium of the people. And what he meant by that was that it allows oppressed people to project in a kind of symbolic and unconscious form, to communicate in a kind of dreamlike way what their self-realization would look like if they were free. In his words, it is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality because it hasn't freed itself yet. And so once people have liberated themselves, according to Marxism, religion will no longer be necessary because it was delusional in the first place. And of course, we've looked at the theory of Freud, for whom religion is meant to give the sense of being protected by a powerful father. He called religion a, quote, universal obsessional neurosis. A more recent explanation of religion, which you tend to see a lot with anthropologists today, I think, but it was also the opinion of Walter Burckhardt, the German scholar whose recreation of the ancient Greek blood sacrifice we talked about last time. So that idea is that religion exists to increase social cohesion, to make people of a certain group feel more at one with each other, so that society can function more effectively, and there'll be some measure of predictability through morality, for example. They see morality as flowing from religion, and morality puts a kind of predictability to the way people behave, so that we'll all have the peace necessary to live reasonably ordered lives. I think these and other explanations of religion are all true to some extent, actually. But I don't find any of them completely satisfying. I don't think they address really the most fundamental cause of human anxiety, or the most fundamental cause of anxiety insofar as it's human. So it doesn't address the anxiety we feel beyond just the fear of needing to the fear that we won't survive physically. So I'm talking about existential alienation, which I've talked a lot about in this series. But when religion is understood as an attempt to solve the problem of existential alienation, its apparent irrationality becomes much easier to understand. In this, I agree with William James, Freud's friend Romain Rolland, who coined this sort of wonderful term, the oceanic feeling, as being at the heart of religion. It's another term for existential oneness, or a unitive state. And also Abraham Maslow had also believed that the search for these unitive states was at the heart of religion. So, in other words, here's how I would put it to kind of sum up what I've been saying. The first point is that thinking or abstraction seems to result in this sense of radical alienation, the sense of being cut off from the world and ourselves, and this seems to erode our hope. But altered or unitive states of consciousness seem to bring benefits to human cognition, health, and creativity, but perhaps most of all, they seem to bring a sense that we've overcome this existential alienation to some extent. And thereby, they seem to bring us some measure of existential hope. So then my third point is that eliciting these unitive states by means of religion is actually more or less universal to humanity. This is something that anthropologists have noted. For example, the Oxford anthropologist Robin Dunbar says that mystical states, ecstasies, and trances, though we all have different susceptibilities to them, he writes, we don't all experience them to the same extent. He writes that they're so universal they can be said to be, quote, part of what it is to be human. Everywhere we see religion, we see these altered states of consciousness. To me, it would seem a nearly impossible fluke if this one element that religions all have in common isn't intimately related to their purpose. But then, on top of that, neurology seems to be advancing in the direction of showing that things like ritual play a role in the brain in bringing these states about. A couple of episodes ago, I talked about some of the discoveries neuroscience has been making over the past couple of decades about these unitive states and psilocybin, for example. But it's also been making interesting discoveries about religion in particular as a means of inducing these states in a whole new field of science that the practitioners of this science call neurotheology. And one of these discoveries is that the aspects of ritual that seem to make it so strange, almost otherworldly on the surface, seem to be capable of doing this, of bringing this about. Perhaps something like we saw with psilocybin, though maybe not quite so dramatically. Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist at Thomas Jefferson University and Hospital in Philadelphia, has been studying religion's effect on the brain for decades. He and psychiatrist Eugene Daquili of the University of Pennsylvania co-wrote a book, Why God Won't Go Away, Brain Science and the Biology of Belief, which came out in 2001. And in it, they write, religious rituals have occurred in virtually every human culture with an almost infinite variety of form. But in every known case, a singular principle appears to hold true. When religious ritual is effective, and it is not always effective, it inclines the brain to adjust its cognitive and emotional perceptions of the self in a way that religiously minded persons interpret as a closing of the distance between the self and God. Or I think one could add the gods. One of the ways it does this, they write, is through rhythm and repetition. And I think we saw some of that in our description of the Greek blood sacrifice with the procession to the temple to the sound of music. Research reveals that repetitive rhythmic stimulation, they write, can drive the limbic and autonomic systems, which may eventually alter some very fundamental aspects of the way the brain thinks, feels, and interprets reality. These rhythms can dramatically affect the brain's neurological ability to define the limits of the self. And we can kind of see these in some, there are rituals, not all rituals are religious. We see this kind of rituals, for example, or these loss of the ego to some extent in response to rhythm at, for example, like concerts or, think of the ritual chanting at sports events where I think it's fair to say at both of these events, there's to some extent, there's a loss of sense of self and a greater cohesion with the people who are around us. Anyway, so one particularly interesting thing they note about ritual is that it's actually older than humanity. Not religion, but ritual is practiced by animals, and it arose far, far back in our evolutionary past. They write, in their basic form, animal rituals are comprised of structured, patterned responses, dancing, vocalizing, head bobbing, and so on, that are rhythmic and repetitive in nature. These behaviors are often very dramatic and very odd, and outside the context of ritual may have no practical function whatsoever. Their purpose, it seems, is to define ritual activity as something very different from normal behavior, which sends the message that when engaged in ritual activity, an animal is up to something special. The rites and ceremonies of human beings clearly echo the ritual behavior of animals. Rhythm and repetition, for example, are elements in almost all human rituals, from the stately cadence of Gregorian chants to the livelier rhythms of a Polynesian fertility dance. Human rituals also feature distinctive behaviors, bows, slow processions, portentous gestures of the hands and arms that serve no practical purpose in everyday life. So neurology is still in a somewhat speculative stage in determining how brain activity corresponds to our subjective mental experiences. You may remember that a few episodes ago, the neuroscientist Robin Carhart-Harris speculated that unitive states were produced by action on the brain's default mode network. So Newberg and D'Aquili write that these states, at least those produced by ritual, arise from the effect of blocking off input into the brain's posterior superior parietal lobe, so in the upper back of the brain, which they also call its orientation association area, or OAA. And they write, the primary job of the OAA is to orient the individual in physical space. It keeps track of which end is up, helps us judge angles and distances, and allows us to negotiate safely the dangerous physical landscape around us. To perform this crucial function, it must first generate a clear, consistent cognition of the physical limits of the self. In simple terms, it must draw a sharp distinction between the individual and everything else to sort out the you from the infinite not you that makes up the rest of the universe. Excuse me. Of the mental states induced by ritual, they write, Like all experiences, moods, and perceptions, these unitary states are made possible by neurological function. More specifically, they're the result of the softening of the sense of self and the absorption of the self into some larger sense of reality that we believe occurs when the brain's orientation area is deafferented or deprived of neural input. So there seem to be different theories of what exactly is going on in the brain to produce these states. But there seems to be some evidence for each of them. And so perhaps in the future, neurology will work out in more detail and with more consensus exactly what's going on. But in the meantime, these ideas, I think, are interesting to contemplate. So anyway, Newberg and d'Aquili write that this deprivation of neural input into the orientation area happens even more during the extreme states of mystical union that sometimes occur during meditative practices or prayer. And in these states, they write, the brain's sympathetic or arousal and parasympathetic or quiescent systems seem to go into overdrive at the same time. And that's what produces this intensity, this state that's at once intense but relaxed. So to sum up, the brain needs strange seeming or unusual activities to get into these unusual and seemingly beneficial states. But how did the brain mechanism that produced these states first arise? So Newberg and d'Aquili think they arose out of the oldest peak experience, to use Maslow's term, of all. And they write, "We can only speculate, of course, but the nature of the evolutionary process suggests that the mind's ability to enter unitary states did not evolve specifically for the purpose of spiritual transcendence, because it evolved before there was spiritual transcendence. Evolution is pragmatically short-sighted. It favors adaptations that provide effective survival advantages in the practical here and now. Those adaptations that increase an organism's chances of survival are genetically passed along, and those that don't are ruthlessly winnowed out. It's difficult to imagine what survival advantages the neurology of transcendence would offer in its partially evolved developmental stages, before there was really religion, and I think they're saying before there was really this kind of existential alienation, before there was that kind of need for it. And hard to find a reason why natural selection would tolerate these neural developments, which wouldn't be operational for untold millions of years. We believe, in fact, that the neurological machinery of transcendence may have arisen from the neural circuitry that evolved from mating and sexual experience. The language of mysticism hints at this connection. Mystics of all times and cultures have used the same expressive terms to describe their ineffable experiences: bliss, rapture, ecstasy, and exaltation. They speak of losing themselves in a sublime sense of union, of melting into elation, and of the total satisfaction of desires. We believe it is no coincidence that this is also the language of sexual pleasure. Nor is it surprising, because the very neurological structures and pathways involved in transcendent experience, including the arousal, quiescent, and limbic systems, evolved primarily to link sexual climax to the powerful sensations of orgasm. The mechanism of orgasm is activated by repetitive rhythmic stimulation. Significantly, orgasm requires the simultaneous stimulation of both the arousal and quiescent systems. As we have seen, the simultaneous activation of these two systems is intimately involved in the process that sets in motion the mind's machinery of transcendence. Mystical union and sexual bliss, therefore, use similar neural pathways. Of course, they write, this doesn't mean they have all the same brain activity in common. There's still different experiences, excuse me, but they're just writing there's this common origin and a kind of overlap that persists. They write, sexual bliss is primarily generated by the hypothalamus, a relatively primitive structure. Transcendent experiences, on the other hand, likely depend upon the involvement of higher cognitive structures, especially those in the frontal lobe and other association areas. The subtle and complex mental rhythms of meditation and contemplative prayer are the neurological triggers that set the process in motion. An evolutionary perspective suggests that the neurobiology of mystical experience arose, at least in part, from the mechanism of the sexual response. In a sense, then, mystical experience may be an accidental byproduct, but this does not necessarily diminish the meaning of spiritual experience. Many of the brain's most sublime and sophisticated functions evolved from humbler neurological processes. The complex cognitive abilities that enable us to appreciate music or create works of art, for example, developed from simpler neural structures that evolved to address mundane survival needs. And of course, attached to mystical experiences normally are vast theological frameworks, myths, creeds, and all kinds of ideas about good, evil, and the meaning of life, as well as different emotional responses. I should add that if this theory of the origin of unitive states interests you, you might be interested to know that Andrew Newberg will be coming out with a new book this summer called Sex, God, and the Brain, How Sexual Pleasure Gave Birth to Religion and a Whole Lot More. It seems the book will delve more deeply into this idea, drawing partly on much more recent research, because the book that I was just citing from you may remember, was from 2001, but this upcoming one draws draws on a paper from 2021 done by a team of scientists led by Newberg. And that paper focuses on a practice known as orgasmic meditation. So anyway, to sum up, whatever the origin of this brain mechanism, I do think the underlying purpose of religion is to incorporate existential unity into our lives, and to thereby give us existential hope and purpose. But an extremely important, I think, related idea is the fact that religion was driven that the fact that religion was driven by one main purpose doesn't mean religion, its practitioners, have been aware of the purpose. And I think this is massive. Since the Enlightenment started to erode religion, the fact that people have mostly not been aware of the purpose of religion has had massively violent and destructive consequences, in my view. And all these consequences point to the possibility that our time may stand in more need of love in the Platonic tradition, Plato's, the teaching on love of Plato and his followers, than ever before. And I plan to be talking about this in the next few episodes. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and hope to see you next time.